It was a chilly afternoon when the sick woman entered the restaurant, her breath shallow, her movements slow. Her frail body seemed to struggle with every step, but there was a certain determination in her eyes. She wasn't asking for much: a warm meal, a place to rest. The scent of freshly baked bread and sizzling steaks filled the air, and for a moment, she felt comforted by the simple things. She walked up to the counter, where a young man was cleaning the surface, his face expressionless. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Can I please have a table? I'm not feeling well." The worker barely looked up from his task. He wiped a glass with unnecessary force, his eyes cold. "You should be at home, not out here bothering everyone," he muttered, barely audible, but enough for her to hear. The woman blinked, taken aback. She didn't expect kindness, but she didn't expect this either. Her hand trembled slightly, and for a moment, she considered leaving, but something inside her held her there. This wasn't the time to retreat. She took a deep breath and tried again. "Please, just a seat. I won't take much space." The worker rolled his eyes and scoffed. "It's not my job to babysit sick people. There's a bench outside. Go sit there." His words stung like a slap. The woman stood there, frozen for a moment, before a sense of quiet resignation washed over her. She didn't have the strength to argue or fight back. She could feel the warmth of the restaurant, the buzz of conversation, the clink of cutlery, but all she could hear was the harshness of his voice. A few people at nearby tables looked over, some shocked, others simply uninterested. But the woman didn't look to them for help. She turned slowly, her face expressionless, and walked out. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and the worker resumed his task, unaffected, as if nothing had happened. But what he didn't know was that this small interaction, this insult, would come back to haunt him in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. There was something about the woman's quiet dignity, her willingness to take the harsh words without retaliation, that felt like a spark in the air, a sign that this moment would not end quietly. The worker, still focused on his task, didn't notice the man sitting by the window, watching the entire exchange with a piercing gaze. A man who, though a stranger, knew that this wasn't just a simple case of a rude worker and a sick woman. Something bigger was unfolding. Something that would change everything. As the woman stepped out onto the street, the cold air hit her face, and she pulled her coat tighter. She walked slowly, her pace deliberate, but there was something in her that was different now. She didn't react, didn't yell or cry. She simply moved forward, as if waiting for the next piece of the story to reveal itself. The man by the window watched her go, his thoughts turning. There was more to her than met the eye. And he had a feeling that the events that were about to unfold would leave everyone shocked, including the worker who had no idea just how wrong he was. The street outside the restaurant was busy, cars honking, people rushing, and yet, the woman walked with a calm that seemed out of place. She moved as if she were disconnected from the world around her, her movements slow but purposeful. Her eyes, though tired and shadowed with illness, held a quiet strength. She didn't look back at the restaurant, there was no need. She had been through worse in her life, and this moment, this insult, was nothing compared to what she had overcome before. As she walked down the street, her breath visible in the cold air, people bustled around her, paying no attention. But there was one person who noticed her, a young woman sitting on a bench outside a nearby coffee shop. She had been watching the entire scene through the window, her curiosity piqued by the woman's demeanor. She had seen the way the restaurant worker had treated her, the cruel dismissal that echoed through the restaurant, and she felt a pang of sympathy for the stranger. But the sick woman didn't stop to talk, didn't turn to seek help from anyone. She kept walking, her pace unwavering. And it was in that silence, in that quiet resilience, that the young woman felt something stirring inside her. Why had the woman not stood up for herself? Why hadn't she said something, even if just for her own dignity? The question lingered as the young woman took a deep breath and watched the woman disappear around the corner, blending into the city's hurried rhythm. But there was something about the way she moved, something that told the young woman this wasn't the end of the story. This wasn't the kind of thing that just faded away into nothing. Inside the restaurant, the worker continued with his duties, the insult hanging in the air like a shadow. He had no idea that his words would have a lasting impact. His attitude, his carelessness, and his apparent indifference were all about to be put to the test. Little did he know, the woman he had dismissed in such a callous manner was not someone to be forgotten. Hours passed, and the worker's shift ended, but the weight of the encounter lingered. As he walked out the back door of the restaurant, he caught a glimpse of something, a small card, fluttering in the wind, lying on the ground just outside the entrance. It had clearly been left there deliberately. The worker bent down to pick it up, unfolding the crinkled paper. His eyes widened in disbelief as he read the words scrawled across the card. It was a simple message, but one that struck deep within him. "You don't know who I am, but soon you will. You will wish you had treated me differently." The worker's heart skipped a beat. A chill ran down his spine, and for the first time, he wondered if perhaps there was something more to the sick woman than he had realized. Who was she? Why had she left the card behind? The thought gnawed at him as he walked away, an unsettling feeling taking root in his chest. Meanwhile, the woman, having gone a few blocks away, sat down on a park bench. She rested her head against the cold metal, closing her eyes for a moment to gather her strength. She had made no effort to retaliate. She didn't need to. The universe had a way of correcting things, she believed. There was no point in arguing with someone who would never understand. As the cold wind blew against her face, she couldn't help but smile faintly. This was just the beginning. Soon enough, the man who had insulted her would realize how wrong he had been, and she would make sure he understood in the most unexpected way. But for now, she would rest. Her journey was far from over, and the next part of her story was about to unfold in ways that no one could have predicted. The night had fallen, casting a quiet stillness over the streets. The restaurant was now closed, and the worker was on his way home. But the events of the day kept replaying in his mind, his harsh words, the cold dismissal of the woman, and the strange, cryptic message left for him outside. It was hard to shake the feeling that something was out of place, something more than just an angry customer. But what? Who was she really? As he walked down the quiet street, he barely noticed the figure approaching him from behind. It wasn't until the man was right beside him that he realized someone was there. "Excuse me," the voice was calm, yet it had a firmness that made him stop in his tracks. The worker turned around to see a middle-aged man with a calm expression, but his eyes held something deeper, an intensity that caught him off guard. "Yes?" the worker asked, his voice tinged with irritation. He didn't have time for strangers. "I couldn't help but overhear your situation at the restaurant today," the man said. His voice was low and deliberate. "You must be feeling a little uncomfortable right now." The worker's brow furrowed. "I'm fine," he snapped, ready to walk away, but the stranger continued, unfazed by the worker's defensive tone. "Are you really? You seem disturbed." The stranger's eyes flickered with an understanding that unsettled the worker. "You insulted someone today, didn't you?" The worker froze. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his mind racing. How did this man know about the incident? "Don't worry," the stranger said softly. "I'm not here to judge you. But what if I told you that the woman you insulted isn't just some sick customer? What if she's someone who can change everything for you? For your life?" The worker stiffened, irritation bubbling inside him, but there was also a twinge of curiosity. He had never felt this strange combination of feelings before. Anger. Confusion. But there was also something else, fear. "She's just some random woman," he muttered, but even as he spoke the words, he felt they weren't convincing. The stranger smiled slightly, as though he had expected this response. Do you think your actions have no consequences? Think again. He took a small step closer, his voice almost a whisper now. I'm not here to warn you about what will happen. I'm here to let you see it. Before the worker could respond, the stranger turned and walked away, vanishing into the crowd as if he had never been there. The worker stood there, frozen, a sense of dread creeping over him. What had just happened? What had that man meant by those words? And how did he know so much? The worker hurried home that night, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The universe, it seemed, was trying to teach him a lesson. And it wasn't going to be an easy one. Meanwhile, across town, the sick woman sat in a quiet park. She had returned to the same bench, the same place where she had found a moment of peace earlier. But this time, she wasn't alone. The mysterious stranger who had been watching her from the window of the restaurant had found her. He had approached her with a calm, knowing gaze, his movements slow but confident. I think we need to talk, he said simply. She didn't flinch. She didn't even ask who he was. You're the one who was watching, aren't you? She asked. The stranger nodded, his face serious. You're not just anyone. I know that. And I know you have a plan. But that worker, he's going to be hard to reach. The woman tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. He's already begun to realize the truth. Slowly. But the real change will come soon. He won't forget me. She paused, looking at the stranger. And he won't forget what he did to me. The stranger seemed satisfied with her words. I've been where he is. I understand that feeling, the guilt, the fear that comes when you know you've crossed a line. But it's not easy to make amends. You can't force people to change. They have to want it themselves. The woman's lips curled into a faint smile. He will want it. In time, he will see that he's not the one in control of this story. The stranger looked at her closely, his eyes lingering for a moment before he spoke again. You're not the victim here. You're the one writing the ending. And with that, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving the woman alone once more, but this time, not vulnerable. There was something powerful about the way she carried herself, something the worker would soon understand. The following day was a blur for the worker. His morning was filled with the usual routine, the clinking of dishes, the constant hum of voices, and the ever-present flow of customers. But beneath the surface, a quiet tension had settled in him, one he couldn't shake off. Every time he passed by the restaurant entrance, his eyes flickered toward the door, expecting to see the sick woman again. But she never returned. He couldn't get her out of his mind. It wasn't just the woman. It was everything, the way she had been so calm when he insulted her, the way she had left without saying a word. There was something about her that didn't add up. Something that made him question everything he thought he knew about the world and the people in it. As the day dragged on, the worker found himself growing restless. The other staff members noticed his distracted attitude, his lack of enthusiasm. One of them, a waitress who had been working there for years, approached him during a slow moment. Hey, you all right? You seem off today, she asked with a raised eyebrow. The worker shrugged, trying to mask his unease. I'm fine. Just tired, I guess. But the waitress wasn't convinced. It's about that woman, isn't it? The one you yelled at yesterday. Everyone's been talking about it. The worker's stomach sank. He didn't want to hear anyone's opinions, didn't want to face the reality of his actions. But the waitress pressed on. You know, I heard she left a message for you outside. Something cryptic. Said you'd regret what you did. His heart skipped a beat. The message. He had almost forgotten about it, but now it flooded his thoughts once again. What did it mean? What was she trying to say? I don't know what you're talking about, he muttered, turning away. But the waitress wasn't backing down. "You should talk to her, you know. She wasn't just some sick woman. There's something more to her. And I'm not the only one who's noticed it." The worker clenched his fists, frustration building inside him. He didn't want to deal with this, didn't want to confront the guilt gnawing at him. But deep down, he knew he couldn't escape it. He had done something wrong, and no amount of ignoring it would make it go away. Later that afternoon, after his shift ended, the worker couldn't stop thinking about the woman and the strange message she had left. He found himself walking back to the restaurant, even though he had no real reason to be there. As he passed by the alley where the woman had stood, his eyes fell on something, a familiar sight that made his heart skip a beat. There, in the dim light of the street, lay the same small card she had left for him the day before. It was as if it had been waiting for him, calling him to face what he had done. Hesitantly, he bent down and picked it up, feeling the weight of it in his hands. The same message, written in bold, shaky letters. "You don't know who I am, but soon you will. You will wish you had treated me differently." The worker's stomach churned. The words were haunting, echoing in his mind. He had dismissed the woman so easily, belittled her for something beyond her control. But now, as he stood there, the reality of his actions hit him like a wave. He had underestimated her, and he knew it. But just as he was about to turn and leave, a voice broke through his thoughts. "You're still here?" The worker spun around, startled to find the woman standing there, her face pale, but her eyes sharp and piercing. She had come back. The woman studied him for a moment, and then, without a word, she reached out and took the card from his hand. She didn't say anything, she didn't need to. The worker felt his face flush with shame, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He opened his mouth, ready to apologize, but the words wouldn't come. She stared at him for a long moment, as if searching for something within him. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice low and steady. "You don't need to apologize to me," she said quietly. "You need to apologize to yourself." The worker blinked, confused by her words. He had expected anger, resentment, perhaps even a confrontation. But instead, there was a strange calmness in her voice, an almost unsettling peace. Without another word, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. The worker stood there for a long time, unable to move. The weight of her words lingered in the air, and he felt something stir within him, a shift, a realization that he couldn't ignore. He didn't know who she was. But he knew that, somehow, she was going to change everything. The worker stood frozen for a long time, the quiet street stretching before him as the woman disappeared into the distance. Her words echoed in his mind, "You need to apologize to yourself." He didn't understand what she meant at first, but something deep within him stirred, a feeling of unease that he couldn't shake off. He had insulted her, yes, but there was more to this story. She wasn't just a sick woman, and he was beginning to sense that he had stumbled into something much bigger than he could have ever imagined. The next morning, the worker found himself consumed by the thought of the woman. Her calmness, her mysterious aura, the way she had left that message, everything felt deliberate. And the stranger from the night before, the man who had spoken to him so cryptically, he couldn't stop thinking about him either. The words of the stranger came rushing back, "You don't know who she is, but soon you will." Who was she? Why did she make such an impression on him, even after everything he had done? The worker couldn't ignore the growing sense of guilt, but more than that, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was a moment of reckoning. Something was pushing him to uncover the truth, to face whatever consequences had been set in motion the moment he had insulted her. It was as though fate had given him no choice but to walk down this path. He decided he couldn't just let it go. He had to find out more about her, who she was, why she had stayed so calm, and why she had left him that unsettling message. There had to be something more to her than just the sick woman he had crossed. And he was about to find out just how wrong he was. Later that afternoon, the worker returned to the restaurant earlier than usual. He couldn't wait any longer. He had made up his mind. The woman, the card, the strange warning, they all had a deeper meaning. He walked through the kitchen, past the staff, and out the back door, into the alleyway. It was where he had found the card the night before, and now, he was hoping to find some clue, anything, that could lead him to an answer. As he approached the spot where she had left the card, he noticed something else on the ground. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than a scrap of paper, but as he got closer, he realized it was a photograph. Hesitant, he bent down to pick it up, his hands trembling slightly. It was a photo of the woman, but this time, she wasn't alone. Beside her was a man, standing close, his arm around her. The picture seemed old, faded by time, and yet, it felt so very personal. He studied it for a long moment. The man in the photo was unfamiliar, but the woman, there was no mistaking her. This was the same woman he had insulted. She was younger, more vibrant, but it was undeniably her. But what really caught his attention was the name written on the back of the photo in bold, unmistakable letters, "The woman who owns it all." The worker felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The phrase was so strange, yet so heavy with meaning. What did it mean? The woman he had dismissed, the woman he had insulted so carelessly, was more than just a sick customer. She was someone of importance, someone who held power, influence, maybe even more than he could ever imagine. But how had she ended up in such a vulnerable position? Suddenly, the pieces started to fall into place. The woman wasn't just a victim. She had a story, a life that no one could comprehend unless they knew the full truth. But he didn't know the truth yet, he only knew what he had seen, what he had misunderstood. And it was beginning to dawn on him that the encounter with her had changed something inside him. As the worker held the photograph in his hands, he knew his next steps were crucial. He had to find her, apologize, and understand who she truly was. This was no longer just about making amends for a wrong he had committed. It was about uncovering the layers of her story, the mysteries that lay beneath the surface. He walked back into the restaurant, his mind racing. As he entered the kitchen, he felt a strange calm wash over him. He had no idea where this would all lead, but he knew one thing: his life had just changed, and so had his understanding of everything around him. The worker spent the next few days in a haze, unable to focus on anything except the woman. The photograph, the cryptic message, the name on the back, all of it had shaken him to his core. He couldn't shake the image of her standing there, so calm in the face of his cruelty. And now, he had begun to understand that the woman he had insulted was someone he should have never underestimated. But he still didn't know who she was, or what her connection was to the mysterious stranger who had spoken to him. Finally, after days of searching, he found himself standing outside a luxurious building, the same name printed on a golden plaque near the entrance. The words on the plaque sent a chill down his spine. "The woman who owns it all, exclusive foundation." It hit him like a ton of bricks. This was her. The woman he had insulted was not only someone of importance, she was the owner of a major charitable foundation, one that helped thousands of people across the world. She was known for her generosity and influence, a figure who was respected, even revered, by those in her circle. How could he have known? How could he have dismissed her so easily? The worker stood there for a moment, staring at the plaque. He felt a deep sense of regret, of embarrassment. He had no idea the kind of person he had treated so poorly. The woman wasn't just some random sick customer, she was someone who could have changed his life for the better. Instead, he had chosen to belittle her, to make her feel small. And now, he was paying the price for his ignorance. As he stood there, caught in a whirlwind of guilt and disbelief, the door to the building opened. A woman stepped out, and his heart stopped. It was her, the same woman who had walked out of the restaurant days ago, the one he had insulted. She was even more striking in person, standing tall, her posture regal, but with a soft grace. The worker didn't know what to do. He couldn't just stand there anymore. The time had come for him to face his mistakes. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice shaking slightly. The woman stopped and turned toward him, her eyes narrowing slightly as she recognized him. There was no anger in her gaze, no bitterness. Instead, there was something more, an understanding, perhaps even a hint of sympathy. "You," she said calmly, her voice steady. "I wondered when you would show up." The worker swallowed hard. He was unsure of how to begin, unsure of what to say. I owe you an apology. What I said to you that day, it was wrong. I never should have treated you like that. You didn't deserve it." The woman didn't speak for a moment. She simply studied him, as though weighing his sincerity. And then, finally, she spoke. "You're right," she said, her voice still calm but with an edge of quiet authority. "But it's not just about the apology, is it?" The worker's heart raced. "What do you mean?" She stepped closer, her gaze never leaving his face. "You can apologize all you want. But until you understand who I am, until you see the bigger picture, your apology means nothing." He felt a knot form in his stomach. "I don't understand," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Why didn't you say something back at the restaurant? Why didn't you fight back when I insulted you?" The woman's expression softened slightly, though there was still an intensity in her eyes. "Fighting back would have been easy," she said. "But it wouldn't have done anything to change your heart. I wanted you to think about what you did. To reflect on your own actions. To realize that what matters isn't just what people do to you, but how you respond to it." The worker stood there, silent. He couldn't help but feel a mix of awe and guilt. There she was, someone with the power to crush him with a single word, yet she had chosen to remain silent, to teach him a lesson instead. "I'm not angry with you," she continued. "But I do want you to understand the weight of your actions. Because when you make someone feel small, when you strip them of their dignity, you don't just hurt them, you hurt yourself. And you'll carry that weight for the rest of your life." The worker felt his throat tighten. He had never understood this before, not in this way. "I'm sorry," he whispered again, the words feeling small in the face of the truth she was showing him. "I really am." The woman nodded, her eyes softening. "Good. Now go. You have a long road ahead of you. It's not just about apologizing to me, it's about making sure you never treat someone like that again. And that's something only you can do." And with that, she turned and walked back into the building, leaving the worker standing there, changed forever. As he watched her disappear, something inside him shifted. The weight of the lesson she had imparted on him felt like a burden, but also like a gift. He understood now. He understood what true power was, not the kind that comes from wealth or status, but the kind that comes from treating others with dignity, no matter who they are. And as he walked away, the worker knew his life would never be the same. He had been given a second chance, a chance to live with empathy, with humility, and with the understanding that his actions had consequences, far beyond what he could ever have imagined. The worker couldn't shake the feeling that his life had been turned upside down in the last few days. After his encounter with the woman, everything seemed to have changed. He found himself questioning his every decision, every interaction. The guilt from the way he had treated her weighed heavily on his conscience, but the lesson she had imparted on him was something far deeper than just an apology. It was a realization about life, about how we treat others, and about the kind of person he wanted to be moving forward. But the road to redemption wasn't an easy one. He couldn't just wake up one day and suddenly become a different person. He had a lot to atone for, and he knew it. The guilt still lingered, gnawing at him as he returned to work at the restaurant, his steps heavier than before. He couldn't just forget what he had done. His first day back at the restaurant was awkward. The other staff members noticed his strange demeanor, his lack of enthusiasm, and his long silences. His mind wasn't on the work, it was on the woman, her words, and the life lesson she had taught him. He had to do better. But how? He found himself thinking about her every day, replaying their conversation in his mind over and over. He had tried to apologize, but he knew that wasn't enough. He needed to show change, not just in words, but in his actions. The thought of treating people with kindness, with respect, was now something that filled his mind constantly. He couldn't unlearn what he had learned. The worker decided he needed to do something more to make things right, not just with the woman, but with everyone. His first step was small but significant. That afternoon, a new customer entered the restaurant, a woman, struggling to hold a child in her arms while carrying a heavy bag of groceries. She looked tired, and the worker immediately recognized the look of someone who had been through a lot. Without thinking, he moved quickly to help her. He held the door open for her and guided her to a table. The woman looked up in surprise, not used to being treated this kindly by anyone, especially in a busy restaurant. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. The worker simply nodded. "It's my pleasure. Can I get you anything to drink?" It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental to him. In that moment, he realized something: kindness didn't have to come in grand gestures. Sometimes, it was the small acts, the ones that no one would ever notice, that made the biggest difference. The woman smiled as she ordered, and the worker felt a small sense of pride, something he hadn't felt in a long time. It was a far cry from the arrogance he once carried, but it felt real. And he knew, deep down, that it was the start of something new. As the days passed, the worker's behavior slowly began to change. He found himself helping more customers without hesitation, offering assistance to his colleagues when they needed it, and generally making an effort to be a better person. He had seen the impact of his actions on the woman, and now he was determined to make sure no one else felt the sting of cruelty that he had caused her. But even as he tried to make amends, he couldn't help but wonder, would it ever be enough? Would the woman, the one who had taught him this life-changing lesson, ever see that he had truly changed? Could he ever truly make up for what he had done to her? Then, one day, as he was wiping down the counter, he saw a familiar face walk into the restaurant. It was her. The woman. She stood in the doorway, her eyes scanning the room. The worker's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected to see her again, not this soon. She caught his eye, and for a moment, they simply stared at each other. There was no anger in her gaze, only a quiet understanding. She walked toward him, and for a brief moment, the entire restaurant seemed to fade into the background. The worker was nervous, but he knew what he had to do. I just wanted to say," he began, his voice shaking slightly, "thank you. For what you said to me that day. It changed everything." The woman gave him a soft smile, her eyes filled with a quiet wisdom. "I'm glad to hear that," she said simply. "But remember, change doesn't happen overnight. It's something you have to work for every day." He nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "I know. And I will. I won't stop trying to be better." She paused for a moment before speaking again. "Good. Just don't forget why you started." And with that, she turned and left the restaurant, leaving the worker standing there, a sense of peace settling over him. She didn't need to say anything more. Her lesson had already been imparted. Now, it was up to him to live it. Days turned into weeks, and the worker found himself slowly adjusting to his new way of living. Every action, every word, every choice was now made with the awareness that kindness and humility mattered more than anything. It was a struggle at times, old habits didn't vanish overnight. But each day felt like a small victory, and he knew he was becoming the person he had always been capable of being, even if it took him a long time to get there. Yet despite all his efforts, something remained in his mind. He knew that he hadn't fully made amends with the woman. Not yet. He had tried to change, but he also understood that redemption wasn't just about his own transformation. It was about showing the person he had wronged that he was genuinely sorry and that he had learned from his mistakes. He wanted her to see that his apology wasn't just words, it was reflected in everything he did. One morning, as he was preparing for another day at the restaurant, he was startled by a phone call. He didn't recognize the number, but something compelled him to answer. "Hello?" he said hesitantly. "Hello," a voice responded. It was familiar, calm, but there was a firmness in it that made his heart race. "This is the woman from the restaurant. The one you insulted." The worker's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected her to contact him. I didn't expect to hear from you. I've been watching," she said softly. "And I've been waiting for you to prove something." The worker swallowed hard. "Prove something? What do you mean?" "Prove that you truly understand the lesson," she replied. "Prove that you've changed. Because actions speak louder than words, and now, you have an opportunity to show that." There was a long pause. The worker's mind raced. Was this another test? Had she been waiting for him to demonstrate more than just the changes he'd made in his personal life? "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice uncertain but determined. The woman's next words were direct, as though she had already anticipated his response. "I want you to help someone who is in need. Not for recognition, not for any reward. But because it's the right thing to do. You've been given a second chance. Don't waste it." The worker was silent for a moment, absorbing her words. He thought about the people he had helped over the past few weeks, the small acts of kindness, the way he had tried to make up for his past mistakes. But this felt different. This was an opportunity to do something real, to prove not only to her but to himself that he had truly changed. "I will do it," he said finally, the words coming out with more conviction than he expected. "I'll show you that I've learned." The line went quiet for a moment. Then, the woman spoke again, her voice softer now. "I know you will. But remember, this isn't about me. It's about you. And the person you choose to help will be the one who shows you just how far you've come. Good luck." Before he could respond, the line went dead. The worker stood there, holding the phone in his hand, his heart pounding. He had no idea what the task ahead would be, but he knew one thing: this was the moment that would define his journey. He couldn't back out now. He had to prove that he was the person he said he was, someone capable of true change. As the day passed, the worker thought about the woman's words. He didn't know where to start, but he knew he had to find someone who needed help. He couldn't afford to overthink it, he just had to act. That evening, as the restaurant grew quieter and the night stretched on, a woman entered. She was clearly in distress, looking exhausted and with a child in tow. The worker's instincts kicked in. He didn't hesitate. He walked up to her and gently asked if she needed assistance. I don't know where to go," she said, her voice filled with desperation. "I've lost everything. My home, my job. I don't know how I'm going to make it through." The worker felt a lump form in his throat. This was it. This was the moment. He had been waiting for this chance, and now it was here. "I can help," he said without hesitation. "Please, come with me. I'll make sure you get what you need." Over the next few hours, the worker took the woman and her child to a shelter, ensuring they had a warm place to stay for the night. He didn't make a show of it, didn't seek recognition. He simply did what needed to be done. When it was over, the worker found himself standing in the quiet shelter, watching the woman and her child settle in. He didn't feel proud, but he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. He had done the right thing. It wasn't about redemption or recognition, it was simply about doing what needed to be done. As he walked back to the restaurant, he realized that this was the moment when everything had come full circle. He had been given a second chance, and now he had finally earned it. The woman who had taught him so much had been right. True change wasn't about saying the right words, it was about showing, through actions, that you had learned, that you had grown. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would always be more people to help, more lessons to learn. But for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path, one that would lead him to a better, more compassionate future. As the worker walked back to the restaurant, his thoughts swirled. He had just helped a woman and her child find a place to stay, to get a little peace and security when they had nothing. It wasn't the grandest of gestures, but it was exactly what he needed to do. There was a profound sense of fulfillment within him, a feeling that went beyond the moment. It was as if something had finally clicked inside him. He understood now what the woman had meant when she said, "Prove that you've changed." For the first time in his life, the worker was fully aware of the weight his actions carried. He realized how much the little things mattered, how much the way we treat others defines who we truly are. The worker now understood that it wasn't just about redemption for himself, it was about helping others and showing them kindness and respect, regardless of their situation. The days after that encounter with the woman and her child felt different. The worker found himself smiling more, even when there was no reason to. He no longer rushed through his daily tasks, but took the time to listen, to genuinely care about the people around him. It wasn't just a transformation on the outside, it was a shift in his heart. He wasn't just changing for the sake of an apology, but because he now saw the world differently. There were moments, small moments, where he could feel the ripples of the lesson he had learned. He helped a fellow worker carry a heavy load without being asked, gave up his break to help a family settle into a table, and offered kind words to customers who seemed to be having a rough day. Each small act of kindness felt like a step forward, and the weight of his previous actions didn't feel as heavy anymore. He was no longer the man who had insulted the sick woman, he was a man who wanted to make the world a little better, one action at a time. But still, the woman lingered in his mind, as she had since the very first day he had met her. She had been his guide, his teacher, and though he never saw her again, he felt her presence in everything he did. He realized now that she had given him a gift, a chance to truly change, to become a better version of himself. And even though she had walked away that day without looking back, her words had followed him every step of the way. The worker walked into the restaurant one evening, the usual busy energy filling the air. He was no longer distracted by his own thoughts, no longer focused on his mistakes. Instead, he felt a deep sense of peace. He had made things right, not with one grand apology, but with consistent, genuine actions. He smiled at the customers, exchanged pleasantries with the staff, and noticed the way his small acts of kindness were starting to make a difference around him. People were more relaxed, more willing to help one another, and the atmosphere of the restaurant felt lighter. He knew this change came from within himself, but also from the lesson the woman had taught him. Change, true change, came when you learned to see the world through others' eyes. One evening, a new customer came in, a woman with a tired look on her face, a child in tow, and a heavy bag on her shoulder. She caught his eye, and for a split second, he saw a glimpse of his past self in her, the same look of exhaustion, the same sense of uncertainty. Without thinking, he walked up to her. "Can I help you with that?" he asked, his voice warm. The woman looked at him, a faint surprise in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but grateful. "I've had a long day." He smiled and helped her carry her bag to a nearby table. "I've been there," he said gently. "Take your time. We've got you." As the woman sat down, the worker went back to his duties, but something inside him shifted again. He realized that he wasn't just helping her for the sake of helping, he was doing it because he genuinely understood what it felt like to be in need. He had been there too, in a way, feeling invisible, alone, and lost. But the woman's lesson had changed him, had shown him that we all carry stories within us, stories that deserve to be respected and understood. The woman didn't know it, but in that simple moment, she had become another part of the journey he had started. Her exhaustion, her quiet strength, reminded him of the woman who had once walked into the restaurant with a sick body but a strong spirit. And as he walked past her table, he didn't feel like the same person who had once made that woman feel small. He felt proud of who he had become, of the person he had worked hard to transform into. That night, as the restaurant emptied out and the quiet settled in, the worker stood by the door, looking out at the street. He realized that life had a way of circling back, of giving you opportunities to make things right, whether it was with others or with yourself. And in that moment, he understood the lesson that had been passed down to him. True change, real growth, wasn't about the big gestures, it was in the quiet, everyday acts of kindness and compassion. And that, he realized, was the real meaning of redemption.